Welcome to Sharp Football Analysis. Today I'm joined by Ryan McCrystal, our draft expert, who's going to answer all of our questions as we transition into 2026 NFL draft season. So make sure you stick around. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Sharp Football Analysis. I am Raymond Summerlin, and today I have the great privilege of picking the brain of our own NFL draft expert, Ryan McCrystal, who, in addition to being one of the best mock drafters around, is also just one of the best evaluators around. He has, I believe, the seventh ranked big board over at Huddle Report over the last 5 years. So really synced up with what NFL teams are thinking and how they're evaluating players. So obviously, everything that he has to say about the draft over the next few months is something that we want to listen to. I'm going to ask him all the questions I have as we get into this, and hopefully the questions you have as well. In addition to this episode of the podcast, you can over Sharp Football Analysis, and you can find his first mock draft, which is over at sharpfootballanalysis.com. So make sure you go and check that out. How are we doing, Ryan?
I'm doing great. I love this time of year. Obviously, I love this season as well, but I start to get a little antsy to get into the full swing of things during those 2 weeks leading up to the Super Bowl, and it starts to feel dead for a little bit. I'm itching to go with the NFL draft stuff, so it's finally here.
And they hit you with the Senior Bowl during that bye week that really just gets you feeling great. Unfortunately, not for a few Penn State legends, or one Penn State legend in particular, not the greatest Senior Bowl, but maybe we'll talk about the running backs a little later on as we get into this. I guess I have to ask you: has the snow finally stopped, or is it? Can you go outside finally? Like, how many days was it?
Yeah, I'm here in Virginia, and my kids had 7 straight snow days recently. The ice is still on the ground, but today it's finally above freezing, so I'm thinking it's going to melt pretty soon here.
That's as a Texan who had one whole day under freezing and the whole world stopped. I can't even imagine that life. That would be wild. But you know what? We're here. We're going to talk about draft, and that's going to be fun for everybody. By the way, the season is over, but draft content, free agency content, and much, much more will be on this podcast feed and on this YouTube feed throughout the rest of the offseason. So make sure you subscribe wherever you find us. Sign up for our newsletter, by the way, at sharp.football. You'll get all of our content as we get through this offseason. Obviously, it's not going to be as much content as we do during the season, but when it comes out, you'll get notified. Sign up for our newsletter at sharp.football. All right, let's get into it. There's no reason to waste any more time here. Let's start talking about the draft. And I guess the first thing to get out of the way is a lot of the conversation when we're heading into draft season is about the number one pick. It doesn't appear as if there's going to be as much conversation this year about the number one pick. It doesn't appear as if there's any controversy at all about they could probably just put him in a Raiders jersey now, right? And who am I talking about?
Yeah, Fernando Mendoza is going to go number 1 overall. As soon as Oregon's quarterback Dante Moore announced that he was going back to school, that was set in stone, which is kind of an interesting place to be because obviously this happens every so often where we have like a clear-cut number 1 overall pick quarterback. Usually, though, it's because it's like Joe Burrow or Trevor Lawrence, and it's like one of these guys that we knew all along, oftentimes for multiple seasons. Caleb Williams, another recent one that we just kind of knew they were going to be number 1. Mendoza, we just sort of ended up here as he continued to get better throughout the season, and everybody else just sort of disintegrated.
You could say sucked. You could say sucked because I think that would be accurate.
Yeah. And then Mendoza was just kind of the last one standing, and the Raiders are one of the most desperate teams ever to be sitting at number 1, needing a quarterback. So he's the guy because he's the only guy. He's not like on that level of a Caleb Williams or a Trevor Lawrence in terms of their prospect status, though. So the Raiders are going to get their quarterback, but then we're just going to kind of have to wait and see whether it actually pans out for them.
Well, some would say the Bears and until very recently, the Jaguars were in the same position with Trevor Lawrence and Caleb Williams, to be fair. But I guess that leads us to just the next logical question is what exactly is the overarching scouting report here for Mendoza? Who is he like? What can he do well, and what are our concern areas?
Yeah, he's kind of a throwback quarterback. I think if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, we might be talking about him with a little bit more optimism because he's a traditional pocket passer and a very accurate one. And that used to work really well. If you're an accurate passer with at least average arm strength for a really long time, that gave you a pretty high floor in the NFL. But who's the last pure pocket passer to be drafted and developed in the NFL? I'm not really sure who that is. There are some guys still around. Obviously, Matthew Stafford is a statue back there now, but he was sort of grandfathered in. He was drafted in an era where that was completely normal. There's some other guys who have sort of become that. I think Jared Goff at this stage of his career is pretty much a pure pocket passer. But when he was drafted, he was mobile. He could run around and make plays outside the pocket, even make some plays with his legs early on in his career. So sometimes guys kind of grow into that. But in terms of a guy who is just a pocket passer as a rookie, it's been a long time since one of those guys was drafted and really panned out. Teams want those more athletic guys, even if they aren't, a Lamar Jackson. They want someone who can at least get outside the pocket and make plays, and that's not really Mendoza's strength. He's the guy who needs to operate within the pocket. And another added element to that is I think there's some questions about how he'll transition just to an NFL offense, because Indiana is a very RPO heavy offense. It made up 25% of their offense this season was RPO plays, and he threw out of RPOs at a really high rate, which is on one hand concerning because NFL teams do not do that at a high rate. Like I said, Indiana has 25%. The NFL average this year was 8.6% of all plays in the NFL were RPOs. And his new head coach used a 5% RPO rate in Seattle last year. So he's going to have to transition into a different style offense. And the good part of that is that they threw out of RPOs at a high rate, which you got to be a very quick decision maker to do that. The easy play out of the RPO is just let the running back keep the ball. The harder play is making a quick decision and throwing it. So there's a positive in that also, is that he did demonstrate the ability to make the harder plays out of the RPO and make good choices, but it's still a transition. So he's going to be a guy who needs a good offensive line. He's going to need a good play caller. We think Clint Kubiak is going to be that kind of coach for him, but it's not like he has a huge track record of success. It's a little bit of an experiment. And then he needs receivers who can make contested catches, because if you're a pocket passer, you have to get the ball out quickly. You have to throw into tight windows, and your receivers have to make those plays. And he had that in Indiana last year with Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr. They were those types of receivers who could make those plays when he threw the ball into tight windows. Will he have that in Las Vegas? As a rookie, very unlikely that he's going to have that. And so I expect we'll see some growing pains. So like I said, he's the clear-cut number one pick. There's no debate. If you surround him with all the right talent, he has the tools to succeed at a high level. He probably isn't going to be surrounded by that early in his career. And so then it becomes a game of patience. Can the Raiders hold off on making sweeping changes and let him grow and build the roster around him?
So I have a question about that, because obviously if you're more of a casual college fan like I am, one of the lasting memories you have of Mendoza is that rushing touchdown,
Yes.
right? It's that moment, that John Elway-esque rushing touchdown where he took the big hit. And so I guess my question would be, obviously we're talking about like an era in which the quote unquote not as mobile quarterbacks are still pretty mobile if you had thrown them into 1985 or something like that. So are we talking about like a Jameis Winston level of mobility of making things happen out of the pocket? Because that definitely wasn't one of Winston's strong suits when he was drafted. Like, I'm trying to think of some comps here of who are we really talking about when we're talking about mobility.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good comp in terms of his athleticism. He's not like 40-year-old Peyton Manning.
Yeah.
But he will be, when he's 40 years old. Like, he is maybe rookie year Peyton Manning.
Yeah,
we're like, fair. Yeah, you see some young clips of Peyton Manning, and he would occasionally run a little bit, but you're not calling a design run for him. And like I said, yeah, they did. In the biggest moment, the lasting image of his college career was a running play. But that was the reason why that play worked. Like, that was such a brilliant play call in that situation. Was Indiana throughout that game had just sort of been almost going through the motions on offense. Like, I had actually shared on social media, I was like, this is kind of a boring play calling game. Like, where are the trick plays? Where are these guys breaking their tendencies? And then, like, 5 minutes after I said that, sure enough, they call a running play on 4th down for Fernando Mendoza, which nobody saw coming. And that's why it worked, because it made no sense. And so you break your tendency in a big moment like that sometimes. Most of the time when he ran the ball, it looked really awkward and wasn't very effective. You're not calling design runs for him, with the exception of an occasional play where you need to change what you're doing. And, so yeah, maybe as a rookie, his second, third year in the league, you occasionally see a play like that. but he's a guy who needs to operate from the pocket. And the other element of that and of why he's not an outside the pocket playmaker is he does not have elite arm strength. I think it's good enough. I don't think it's going to be like the reason he fails, but when he's a starter in Las Vegas as a rookie, his arm strength will probably be in the bottom half of the league compared to other starters around the league. So like it's good enough to play in the NFL, but he's not going to be a guy who rolls out and makes like a brilliant downfield throw on the run because he just doesn't have that kind of arm. And so that's the other added element to really be a playmaker outside the pocket. You need the mobility, but you also need a big arm to make big plays downfield when you're throwing on the run because you're not really getting, the mechanics are different. You can't really step into the throw the same way. You look at any play from college, if he was under pressure and wasn't really able to set his feet, the ball kind of floats out there on him. He's still accurate, so he can make some plays that way. But you don't want him trying to throw into tight windows under those situations. So you're going to try to keep him in the pocket as much as possible.
And I just want to cut it off at the pass before we get some angry messages from Raiders fans. When he says the reason he fails, he's not saying he's going to fail. He's saying if he were to fail, that wouldn't be the reason. Don't come at us, Raiders fans.
Absolutely.
We're rooting for you. I love Clint Kubiak. I actually am very interested in that kind of RPO stuff you're talking about because obviously the NFL is changing pretty dramatically and the meta has changed. Rich and I have been talking about it for years now. And it seems like, especially with this Seahawks Super Bowl win, with the Mike McDonald Super Bowl win specifically, we're going to continue to see this move. But we did see the Colts have a lot of success with RPO with a young tight end and Tyler Warren. Obviously, the Raiders have Brock Bowers. Not exactly the same players, but we're just trying to make connections here. And that's not what we saw with Clint Kubiak, but he also had Sam Darnold. And, we were talking about statuesque quarterbacks. Derek Carr, there's another one that might be in that range for us as well. Of course, he was a second-round pick, if I'm remembering correctly, right? And so like there are differences here as well. Daniel Jones is certainly on the more mobile scale of the quarterbacks, but we have seen that RPO be successful by an offense that shocked everyone with how successful it was with Daniel Jones this year. And so, again, the NFL is changing. It's going to be interesting to see kind of where that lands as we move forward. Finishing up the quarterbacks here, you had one more quarterback in your first round, I believe. That was Ty Simpson at 21 to the Steelers. He wasn't. It's so, just kind of wrapping this conversation up, it's so interesting that we even wrote a column. You wrote an article on the site about, all right, all of these 2026 draft quarterbacks, and this is what we're watching. And so we came into this past college football season with all of these names we wanted to watch. And to be fair to you, you had Fernando Mendoza on that list and said, we need to be talking about this guy. And that aged very well. But then a lot of these other names that we were talking about, Cade Klubnik, who, by the way, I still like Cade Klubnik. I'm going to throw that out there. Nussmeier, I still like Nussmeier as well. But Drew Aller, which it's sad. Penn State legend still Drew Aller. Penn State legend Drew Aller. We have all of these names that we were talking about. Ty Simpson wasn't one of those guys, if I'm remembering correctly. And so now we have Fernando Mendoza, number one with a bullet. Maybe Ty Simpson, you're saying, and then nobody else in your first mock. It's just wild what's happened in this 2026 class.
Yeah, they all completely fell off the map for a variety of reasons. I think, most of those teams didn't have anywhere near the success, and it wasn't all just about the quarterback. Like Nussmeier at LSU, Cade Klubnik at Clemson, Aller at Penn State. Like those teams as a whole fell off the map completely this year, and you can't pin that all on the quarterback. All of those guys are going to be drafted somewhere between the second and fourth round. I think those guys who fell off. Simpson's the guy who climbed up and is kind of in the first round conversation, I guess. I think the main reason he's in the first round conversation is that we've only seen him for 1 year. And so he hasn't been nitpicked as much as some of the other quarterbacks. 1 year starters from college jumping to the NFL, the track record's pretty bad. I don't have the list in front of me right now, but I'm sure you can find people who have compiled it online if you want to go through and dig that up. It's not a high hit rate. I have added concerns based on the fact that he played in a very good offense. Like the offense was that his offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, and Kalen DeBoer, Alabama's head coach, they've been together a long time. They, revived Michael Penix's career when he transferred to Washington and obviously became a first round pick. It's a good downfield passing offense. It is, just like we were just talking about with Mendoza, you don't see that You don't see those types of quarterbacks panning out in the NFL as much. Guys who stand in the pocket and throw downfield, you need a little bit more mobility. And Simpson's not. He's not. He's also not a statue, but he's not quite that guy. So having some of the same questions as Mendoza, but also not having nearly the sample size or the body of work that Mendoza has had to sort of see all of the strengths and weaknesses play out over a longer period of time. I think it's much easier to look at Mendoza and say, yeah, I have some questions, but when it all works out, I've seen it. I've seen him have success over and over and over again. Even when he wasn't surrounded by a ton of talent at Cal, he was having some success. When he was protected in the pocket and was able to throw downfield, and those quick decision makings that he learned from having to play under pressure a lot. We just saw a big body of work, and with Simpson, we saw some success, but it was such a small sample size that you don't really get to know a quarterback well enough. If I were a GM, I would just not be comfortable drafting a guy like that in the first round unless it was like 1 year of just Cam Newton level. He's one of the success stories of a 1-year starter, but he also had one of the greatest seasons in college football history. So yeah, if you perform at that level and you're a 1-year starter, let's go ahead and take you in the first round. Ty Simpson, it was kind of an up and down season. We saw some strengths, some weaknesses. I wouldn't bet on that kind of guy. I'd rather wait until day 2 and get someone who's had a lot more experience, like a Garrett Nussmeier. One of the reasons his season was down was he was playing through an injury. Maybe he comes back fully healthy and looks like what we thought at one point was a future first round pick. So I would rather spend less on one of those guys in the second round, try to revive their career in the NFL with much less invested rather than take a chance on a guy who's only made a handful of starts.
Yeah, I obviously I'm not watching these guys like from an analytical perspective on Saturdays, but every time I watch Garrett Nussmeier, I said that's an NFL quarterback every time I watched him play. And so he is one that I'll try to dig more in and watch more, but I'm not a film grinder. I'm not going to like say that these are my quarterback rankings, but every time I watched Nussmeier play, I thought he was good. There are some other names here, right? Like Trinidad Chambliss. I believe didn't he petition for another year and then lost that?
Yeah, so we do not know whether Trinidad Chambliss is going to be in the NFL draft class, which is one of the strangest scenarios we've seen pan out in a long time. It reminds me of back in, I think it was 2004, when Mike Williams and Maurice Clarett challenged the 3-year rule. And at this stage of the process, I think they may have even gone to the combine that year. I think it may have been like early March when we finally found out that they were not eligible. That's kind of the boat we're in with Trinidad Chambliss. He's trying to go through the court system to get an injunction to say that he's allowed to come back and play, because obviously he was the transfer from Division II Ferris State, had 1 season at Ole Miss, and he's trying to gain more eligibility based on claiming that one of his seasons at Ferris State was he didn't play due to an injury. Seems like he has a very flimsy case there. There's no documentation that the NCAA has already said. There's absolutely no evidence that he had an injury. But he's going to go through the court system in Mississippi, and I think most people are assuming that a Mississippi judge is going to say, yes, you can continue to play in the state of Mississippi. So we probably won't see Trinidad Chambliss. But if he does enter the draft, he maybe enters the first round conversation. He's another guy where we don't have a huge sample size with him against high level competition, but he has mobility, which almost none of these other quarterbacks have. Cade Klubnik does too a little bit. He's a pretty good athlete, but Chambliss is really the only other guy who's going to be like a dangerous outside the pocket playmaker. And so that's an interesting element if he does get thrown into this draft class. At some team, he may get bumped up a little bit just because he sort of brings a skill set that is lacking in this class overall.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a lasting memory of him just being in an absolute flow state in the playoffs. Just unbelievable the way he was playing. So other names, just I guess to know, would be Carson Beck, obviously, who ended his career in the most Carson Beck fashion of all time, unfortunately. And then Taylon Green. Taylon Green's an interesting name, but we'll talk about all of those as we move forward. Reading your mock, I was taken by how many edge rushers were there, especially in the top 10 in the first round. This appears to be a relatively strong class for edge rushers. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes and no. It depends on how you look at it. Arvell Reese was more or less a linebacker at Ohio State, but is probably going to be like a Micah Parsons type player in the NFL, where he's mostly used as a pass rusher once he goes to the NFL. He's bigger for a linebacker, but athletic enough to be an off-ball linebacker. So I think he's probably going to be mostly an edge rusher, especially if he's getting drafted early. You're going to want to use him at the more valuable position, and then if it doesn't pan out, you can always move him back to linebacker. So I think that's kind of where someone in the top 5 is going to draft him. After he's off the board, it becomes a little murkier. It's a deep class. I think we're probably going to see David Bailey from Texas Tech go in the top 10. Ruben Bain, I have him in the top 10 right now, but I don't know what how the NFL is going to view him. He is short and he has very short arms. The Athletics' Dane Brugler reported that his arm length is under 31 inches, which is T-Rex like arms. Guys that get drafted in the top 10 as edge rushers are often
sorry everybody else.
Yeah. Edge rushers who get drafted in the top 10, they usually have like 35-inch. They're usually like 6'6" with 35-inch arms, or at least 34-inch arms. Teams would prefer. This is
one of the fun things. I don't interrupt you, but one of my favorite things, if you don't follow the draft closely, one of my favorite things about the draft ever is how they talk about the biggest people you've ever seen, and they have these like covers. So I remember very vividly when Aaron Donald was coming out, and he was a bit over 6 foot tall and like 280 pounds or something like that, and they continually called him undersized. And that's what I played football at, and nobody had ever called me undersized in my entire life. It's hilarious. It's such a funny thing with the draft. Sorry to interrupt you.
Absolutely. It is strange to call a guy who's
arms for a edge rusher, and how important that is. I mean, we've seen all the Will Campbell conversation after this Super Bowl on the other side of that equation. It is actually an important thing.
Yeah, a lot of teams still value it. It's sort of there's a growing number of GMs and scouts who think it's less important. The Patriots are one of the front offices who have openly said they just don't care about arm length as much. And of course, they drafted Will Campbell. And it's probably not the reason why he had some struggles this year, but it may have been a contributing factor. Most teams still do care about it. And so what is Ruben Bain? He was phenomenal in the playoffs, especially this year. He just terrorized teams. But when you dig a little bit deeper into that, the weakness of Ohio State was its offensive line this year. Ole Miss did not have a very good offensive line, and then Indiana did, and he wasn't as effective in the championship game. So I don't know. That's one of the things that I'm really interested to find out more about, especially after we go through the combine and teams get to meet with him more, and we actually, we get some actual measurements for him and see how he tests. Well, I think we'll get a better gauge for how the NFL views him. Some teams might view him as a defensive tackle, in which case he's probably not going to go in the top 10. Other teams may view him as an edge, but just think the size is too much of a risk. I don't know. And then there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, I had a bunch of other guys. Those are the 3 I had in the top 10, but I've got there's a much longer list of guys who could go in the first round, but
I had the list here for you if you want it. Like, you had Keldrick Falk to the 14 to the Ravens, Cassius Howell, number 20 to the Cowboys, Zion Young, number 28 to the Texans, Akeem Mesidor. That's Ruben Bain's teammate, I believe, right? Number 32 to the Seahawks. And I believe you mentioned 2 or 3 more that could possibly be first rounders.
Yeah, there's a bunch of guys who are going to be in the conversation. How they test, how they interview is going to ultimately determine where they end up, because there's a lot of questions with each of these. Like Keldrick Falk and TJ Parker from Clemson, who I don't think I had in the first round, but will be in the conversation. They're younger guys. I believe they're true juniors who are probably going to test well, but the production didn't quite live up to expectations. There were guys that were big recruits and were supposed to tear it up this year, and it just didn't quite pan out. They were in early top 10 mock drafts, in last May, and it didn't quite live up to those expectations. Then you've got other guys like Missouri's Zion Young, who's in the mix. He's a transfer from Michigan State. He had a breakout senior year, but he doesn't have the long track record of dominating. Then you've got Cassius Howell and Akeem Mesidor, 2 guys who are very productive over a longer period of time, but they're 5th-year seniors, so they're a little bit older, and they're going to get pushed down. Most teams will prefer to take a Keldrick Falk or TJ Parker, sort of an unpolished younger guy, than the 5th-year senior. Teams, especially in the first round at least, would still bet on upside of a younger prospect rather than the guy who's maybe closer to already being at his ceiling, which Howell and Mesidor probably are. So there's a bunch of guys who are kind of in the conversation. I think if I'm a team that already has a decent pass rush, but maybe wants to add like the second best guy in the pass rush unit, or add some depth, and I'm comfortable taking someone on day 2, I'd feel pretty good, because there's going to be a bunch of guys that we haven't even mentioned yet that are going to be in the mix. If I'm sitting there in like the 10 to 25 range and I need someone, I'm feeling a little nervous about trying to choose between this mix of guys, all of whom probably don't belong in that range. But if you really need to address that need, there's a lot to choose from. So you're probably going to talk yourself into one of them. So yes, it's a strength in the sense that it's a really deep class and there's a lot to choose from. It's a weak, but it's not a great class in terms of having a bunch of guys that I'm confident are going to come in and make a difference right away.
Absolutely. And producer Rami comes in with it's like how 33-year-olds are so old in the NFL. The
Yes.
Aaron Rodgers debate about like how could he possibly be doing this at the ancient age of 41? I'm like, calm down, folks. Let's calm down. Let's calm down just a little bit. All right, I want to move and talk about Caleb Downs a little bit here because as just again, I'm just a casual college football fan. Watch my favorite team and watch all of the other big games. It seems like Ohio State's safety Caleb Downs might be the best player in the draft just from watching him play. You have him going number 6 overall, but I've also seen, just looking around at mocks and trying to get into the draft season and start doing my research, I've seen people say he's going to might fall out of the top 10 just because of positional value and how people are valuing safeties. Is that in the range of outcomes for him? Because am I right that like if you were just saying who's the best player in this draft, that he's in that conversation?
I don't think he's just in the conversation. I don't think there's much of a debate. Maybe you could argue Arvell Reese, but less of a long-term track record. Downs was a stud from the moment he stepped on the field at Alabama. Then he transferred after Saban retired and has been great at Ohio State for a few years. He's so unique because typically at positions like safety and off-ball linebacker, you don't often have a true freshman step in and just immediately become the best player at his position across college football. Those are positions where you need to develop a football IQ. You need experience. The raw athleticism is nice and you'll make some highlights as a freshman, but you're probably going to be out of position a lot. And Caleb Downs is just, he was playing like an NFL veteran as a true freshman at Alabama. He came to Ohio State and just immediately became one of the leaders of that defense and, one of the best defensive players in the country as a true sophomore. That's really unique. He's falling in mock drafts, and I understand why some people are hesitant to believe he's a top 10 pick because safeties don't get drafted that high very often. We also just the most recent high profile safety we saw, Kyle Hamilton. We thought he might be a top 10 pick and he ended up sliding to, I think, 14th overall by the Ravens. That is, I think, skewing how people are viewing Downs a little bit because through most mock drafts throughout that process, Hamilton was in the top 10 and then he slides all the way to 14 on draft day. I think the perception was that was probably happening because, well, teams don't value safety that much. It is objectively a little bit less valuable than some of the other positions. Kyle Hamilton was also 6'4", or he is 6'4". The number of defensive backs who are 6'4" who pan out is a tiny list. You're not as agile for the most part, besides for a few freaks like Kyle Hamilton. You're just not as agile. And so if you get in the wrong matchup with a smaller slot receiver, you get burned. And there are, going back decades, there have been teams who have tried to put guys like that because you kind of become enamored with a really fast 6'4" defensive back and think, man, like think about how we can match this guy up, how long his arms are. But then it turns out like, a 5'11" receiver can just lose him too easily. The fact that Kyle Hamilton has panned out probably helps Downs a little bit. It certainly helps that Kyle Hamilton went to Baltimore, a team that is great at disguising its coverages, moving its defenders around, and avoiding putting him in those bad situations. If Hamilton, as great as he is, went to the wrong team, it could have worked out differently. If he went to a defensive coordinator that wasn't as good at avoiding putting him in those bad situations. Downs, however, he's not that tall. I forget exactly what he is, 6 foot, 6'1", something like that. He's more of built like a traditional safety. Like I said, the football IQ is off the charts. He's going to crush the interview process. I would be very surprised if we don't come out of the combine when he finally sits down and talks to teams with overwhelming reviews that, yeah, he's obviously a top 10 pick and he's in the conversation to go in the top 5 because he's that safe of a prospect. It's just if you're faced with, like I was just saying, comparing him to some of the NFL or the defensive end prospects, like if you need a pass rusher and you're thinking about Ruben Bain, but he's really good, but does he have the right measurables? Oh, but we could also just take Caleb Downs and get a safety to start for us for 10 years. I think ultimately someone in the top 10 is going to make that decision. Yeah, it's not that valuable, but plug him in for a decade. And that's going to ultimately be the decision.
And I also think like your point about or my point I made earlier about the NFL's changing, right? And so we
Mhm.
see, you mentioned Baltimore and what they did with Kyle Hamilton. Well, who came out of that, right? We have Mike McDonald going to Seattle, and what they were able to do with Nick Manowari and with
Yep.
Josh Jobe and with Devin Witherspoon and these defensive backs that can also play in the run, that allow you to play lighter against bigger fronts, that give you a better opportunity because you can still stop the run, but you can deal with the tight end issue. We have Brian Branch and what he's able to do for the Lions defense. I do wonder if the way we're viewing some of these players, if we're talking about just like a free safety who's going to stand in the back and, cover and lock everything up, or, I'm not going to say these guys would still be very valuable in the NFL today, but like an Earl Thomas or Ed Reed kind of guy. Those guys would obviously still be very valuable today because they're the best that have ever done it. But if we're talking about like that archetype of player, then maybe so. But like if you can come up and stop the run and you can cover slot receivers and you can be really involved in the box area, then, then we're talking about a different, I think, level of value, because we're basically talking about a different position. And I think that that's maybe the thing to think about is Caleb Downs. It seems to me, just watching him play, he's one of those guys. I believe that is how he was used at Ohio State under Knowles, right? As kind of that kind of guy. So it seems he's that kind of guy. Am I right about that?
Yeah, he can do it all. I mean, you can use him as a center fielder in the deep secondary if you want to. Some teams that use a higher rate of two high coverages, if you want to use him more in the deep secondary, you can certainly do that. But yeah, he played around the box a lot. When he's in the box, he's more like a linebacker. And he doesn't quite have linebacker size, but his ability to move that way and his football IQ, like I said, his ability to anticipate and play the run because he sees it developing a step ahead of everybody else, that was a huge asset to Ohio State's defense the past 2 years. And I think that's what teams are going to really fall in love with.
All right, I have to move on and talk about, put on my fantasy and bio hat and start talking about some spreadsheets. And I have to ask you about the fantasy players we need to know. You actually had a lot of wide receivers in the first round again, which is not surprising given the NFL. We have Carnell Tate, number 8 to the Saints, Jordan Tyson, number 12 to the Cowboys, Mekhi Lemon, number 16 the Jets, KC Concepcion, number 27 to the 49ers, and Denzel Boston, number 31 to the Patriots. Had some other names. Brazel was in there, right, that you were talking about. I think if I'm going through that list, Mekhi Lemon's the one that I think is the most interesting to me, because he seems to have a gap between maybe how good people think he is and how much that translates to the NFL, just based on what I'm reading. Is that a kind of a fair thought on what we're thinking with Mekhi Lemon?
Yeah, I mean, this comparison feels a little too on the nose because they went to the same school, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is a pretty good comp for him in terms of being a guy who maybe doesn't have the craziest measurables or the craziest speed, but he just catches everything, can line up in the slot, can line up outside, and he could be a very high volume receiver, even if he isn't necessarily the type of guy that, is going to dominate stretching the field or dominate after the catch. He's just so good at everything that the volume that he can add to your offense and the reliability of having that type of weapon that you can move around makes him really valuable. So he's definitely one of the 3 guys that I think are sort of locked in as first round picks at this point are Carnell Tate, Jordan Tyson, and Lemon. Those are the 3. And then there's, you mentioned some of the others that are going to be in the mix, and it's just going to come down to preference as far as who wants what type of receiver.
Concepcion, he's more after the catch kind of guy, right? Am I right about that? I do think that's interesting. You had him going to the 49ers. Obviously, they have Ricky Pearsall there, who would seem to me his best usage might be in that role, even though I think they used him a little bit more downfield this year. We obviously need him to stay healthy. We don't know what Brandon Ayuk's gone. We don't know what's happening with Juwan Jennings. The Concepcion one is interesting, but like, is that actually what they need? I think is a fair question. But like you said, that's what we're going to do this draft process for. We're going to go through it and we're going to figure out what people like. One more for you real quick. You had Jeremiah Love in the top 10. You had him going number 9 to the Chiefs. That tells you, I think, everything you need to know about Jeremiah Love if you have him mocked that high. I don't really think we need to talk about it. But in there, you suggested this isn't a strong running back class. You did have some names you mentioned in the mock, Jonah Coleman, Jadarian Price, Penn State legend, Katron Allen, as possible. I love Katron Allen. It's possible day 2 guys. But like, it seems that you think this is not a very strong running back class. We're not going to even have a ton of day 2 guys that we really like. Is that a fair reading of kind of where you are right now?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty bad running back class. I mean, Love certainly raises the ceiling of it because he could be really special. Just he does a little bit of everything. He's got power, speed, good pass catcher, you mentioned, fantasy players like Love is the no-brainer pick in your rookie drafts at 1-1. And, even in redrafts, he's almost certainly going to be a first round pick. Where he lands, I guess, depends a little bit, but he's just a Jahmyr Gibbs type of guy who's just going to be
Bijan Robinson. Like, are we in that? Like, yep. We're in that kind of range, right? Yeah,
for sure. He can do everything. After that, I don't know that there's a starter in this class. Obviously, some guys are going to get opportunities because they always do. Jadarian Price, his Love's teammate at Notre Dame, he's powerful, like a powerful running back. He's probably not a 3-down guy though, more like an early down power runner. Jonah Coleman and Katron Allen are kind of both also in that, realm of like, yeah, they could maybe be, decent early down running backs, but they're probably not great, passing down type of guys, which in today's NFL means that even if technically you're starting because you're out there on first down, you're like kind of not the number one guy. So the fact that we have those types of guys are like the next running backs off the board, the likely day 2 picks are more of those like power between the tackles runners. We'd be excited about those guys even 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. In this version of the NFL, there's not as much value in that. And so I don't think that it's hard to get excited about it, but at the same time, I will say I wouldn't be shocked if one of them gets bumped up into the first round, just because there is no depth in this class. It gets brutal as you go down the list of guys because so many players are going back to school. It used to be that all of the good juniors entered the draft, right? Because you want to go make your money, except that if you don't think you're a first round pick, which almost no running backs are, stay in school and collect that, $2 million paycheck from the school that really values you, because running backs are more valuable there. So we're seeing that effect on the college game right now, is that there just isn't that like 21-year-old stud entering the draft other than Jeremiah Love. And so it's pretty brutal. So if you need someone, if a team at the back end of the first round thinks they need it, or even a team at the beginning of the second round wants to trade up a few picks, I wouldn't be shocked if someone like Jadarian Price ended up in the first round, just because there's nothing to choose from. And if you miss out on one of those names that I mentioned, you're probably not getting anybody who's going to contribute from this rookie class, because going down the list any further than we just did, there's not a lot to pick from.
Yeah, to your point, Jeremiah Love could have been in the last draft class, right? Like, I know that Penn State's guys, Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, who Nick Singleton unfortunately suffered an injury, although I don't think after this past year he was going to be in this conversation anyway, but suffered an injury. Like, those two guys were expected to be in the draft last year, and they both came back. So like, we're seeing a much different situation here with running backs, and it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out as we go. All right, that's it. Head over to the mock draft at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Make sure you check that out. Make sure you follow Ryan on Blue Sky. Check out all of his content. Sign up for the newsletter. You'll get access to all of it. We'll have at some point in the relatively near future after the combine, we'll have a big board come out. We'll have more mock drafts. We'll have mock drafts for Brendan Donahue as well on the site. So there's going to be a lot of draft content. We'll get we'll get Rich Rebar to have his fantasy kind of view on the fantasy positions, the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. We'll have him talk himself into some bad running backs, as we do every single year here in the draft. So we'll be excited about that. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast, go sign up for the newsletter, head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com, read the mock draft, and we'll be back to talk with you really, really soon.